Good morning. Our scripture reading is from 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 22, and it's on page 246 of your Pew Bible. And if you don't have a Bible at home or you know somebody who could use one, we would love for you to take that as a gift. On page 246. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness at En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel who seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day in which the Lord has told you, behold, I will give you your enemy in your hand, and you shall do with him as you seem good to you." Then David arose stealthily and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks to harm'? Behold, the day in your eyes you have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. And I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom the king of Israel has come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." As soon as David finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, and for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared that this is how you have dealt with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me in your hands. For if a man finds his enemy and lets him go away safe, so may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Emmeline. Well, one of my favorite segments that I see all the time on TV or on podcasts are the ones that ask this question. Is this thing overrated, underrated, or properly rated? Have you heard people argue about these things before? In the age of hot takes and heated debates and hasty reactions, we can endlessly argue this question about all sorts of things. Bands, restaurants, books, athletes, apps, TV shows, movies, cities, you name it. We love debating, is this thing overrated, underrated, or properly rated? I'm sure even Bill somewhere, actually I know for a fact that he does, have a secret list of the most underrated and overrated national parks. You can do this with anything, right? morning, I just want to give you a few of mine, and I'm sure that some of you are not going to agree with me, and that's what I love about it. That's the fun of it. So I'm just going to say a few of mine this morning. Here's the first one. I've been saying this for a long time. I think that Arby's, the restaurant, is one of the most underrated fast food restaurants. It doesn't get a lot of love, but they got some good food, right? You can crave that cheesy beef and cheddar, right? And my next one. I think that cake is super overrated and pie is way better. I don't know what the thing is with cake, but every time I eat it, it's just like, it leaves something to be desired. It's a little dry, whatever. Rather eat pie. That's just me. Next one, let's go into music a little bit. I think that the band Styx is the most underrated classic rock band. They've had 4 platinum albums, and they're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What's going on, right? I think they're just dinging them for the little divorce that they had. So, but I think Styx is one of the most underrated classic rock bands. Love them. Next slide. I think that finally both Nikola Jokic and Eric Spoelstra are properly rated. People are starting to see in this NBA Finals that, hey, they're both really good at what they do. Next one, let's go to TV. I think Nathan For You, I don't know if anyone's seen the show Nathan For You. I think it's a really underrated TV show. I wish more people knew that this existed. It's really, really funny. Back to food real quick. McDonald's fries are so overrated. They're so overrated. All right, guys, you might disagree with me, but man, never enjoyed those. If you are interested in literature, I think that Spanish author Carlos Ruiz Zafón is one of the most underrated novelists. And then finally, kids, I'm gonna make you angry right now. I think Frozen is an overrated Disney movie. And adults might be mad at me too. I think Frozen's overrated. I'd rather watch Moana. I'd rather watch Encanto, both recent Disney movies that are way better. And I'd also rather watch what I think are the most underrated Disney movies, The Jungle Book, Fox and the Hound. Yeah, right? Okay, so we can all spar in the lobby after this. We should have done a donut day where we could just have donuts and argue with each other. I could go on. I thought I'd just making this the whole sermon, but I'm not gonna do that. Because this morning, I also want to suggest that there's actually a question that is the most underrated question in life. That of all the questions that we could ask over the course of our lives, this question might be the most undervalued question in our current cultural moment. See, it's pretty common for us to ask questions along these lines. What should I do with my life? Where should I live? How should I pursue my dreams? Or even the question why, right? Why is this thing happening? Why do things work like this? Anyone who knows a toddler knows how overrated the question why is. We like to ask the whats, the wheres, the hows, the whys. But one of my life's most underrated questions is this: when? When? And I think that's because a lot of the time, the answer seems obvious, right? When should I figure out this problem? When should I get my dream job? When should I find that lifelong friend? When should I meet my future spouse? When should I get that raise? When should I start a family? Asking for a friend. As soon as possible, right? If not sooner. In fact, questions like what and how and when and why are questions that by their nature are greedy for the immediate. Because we assume that once we figure out the answer to those questions, the answer to when is clear. Now. Which is why when God doesn't match our timeline, we feel disoriented, right? Because we live in a world where the instant is idolized and the delayed is demonized. And this speaks to the tension that we're going to wrestle with this morning as we continue in the story of David. And it's this tension. Throughout history, waiting was synonymous with knowing God. If you read the Hebrew scriptures, you cannot miss the way that knowing God is deeply tethered to waiting on God. But as true as that is, in our moment, waiting is more often than not interpreted by us as missing out on what God has for us. Or sometimes, he must be ignoring us, right? He must be ignoring us. Waiting is one of life's greatest challenges that we can easily feel lost when it comes to waiting today. But what we're going to see this morning as we continue studying the life of David is that waiting is ultimately the only way to walk with God well. Waiting is ultimately the only way to really walk with God well. The question we're going to ask this morning goes something like this: how do we pursue God's win and wait well? How do we pursue God's win and wait well? If you know anything about the story of King David, you probably also know a little something of King Saul. And in many ways, both have their high points and their low points, right? But in many ways, these two men couldn't be more different. And one of the key distinguishing markers that we see take front stage in the text that Emmeline read for us this morning, one of the key distinguishing markers between these two men is how they navigated the question, when. How did they navigate God's win? We're going to see, and what we see even more broadly in the story of 1 and 2 Samuel, is that when God invites them to wait, it is David who humbly waits and not Saul. So we're picking up the story in chapter 24, if you're open there. We find him, King David, on the run from Saul. Because Saul has set out to kill David because he's afraid that David is going to try to usurp his throne. So we're in this weird tension where even though Saul remains on the throne, God has already anointed David and promised that he will make him king. So Saul is current king. David has been anointed as king, but he's not yet on the throne. In fact, for now, David's anointing doesn't have him sitting in the throne, but hiding in a cave. And as David's hiding there, the most unthinkable thing happens. Saul had heard that David was running around somewhere in that area, so he's out in that area looking. And then he enters the cave to, as the ESV tells us, relieve himself. That is exactly what you think it means. That's not one of those phrases that's been lost in translation. It means the same thing today as it did then, all right? He came into the cave to relieve himself. So Saul is in the cave. He's probably facing the wall in one of the most vulnerable positions you could imagine, right? And David and his men are hiding in the back of that very same cave. Now, in the eyes of David's men, this is a dream come true. It's perfect. They tell David, dude, do it. Finish Saul off. Then the kingdom will finally be yours. Is that they even use the words and promises of God that he spoke to David already. They're like, dude, God told you that he'd give you your enemy into your hands. Now's your chance. Circumstances couldn't be any better. Kill him. And at the start, David's pretty intrigued by this idea. So he approaches Saul quietly from behind, which again is uncomfortable. I'm convinced that this story is why men today have adopted the buffer urinal policy in bathrooms, because of stories like this, where a man sneaks up on a man while he's relieving himself, and he gets this close, but David doesn't choose to kill him at first, but rather he takes a knife and he cuts off a corner of the robe Saul is wearing. That's like one of the, seems like just one of the worst pranks. Gotcha. He just cuts off a corner of the robe, and Saul seems to notice, not to notice that anything happened, right? Cuts the corner of the robe and runs back. Saul doesn't notice that anything happened and leaves the cave, okay? What we have to draw our attention to is that immediately, as soon as he has cut off a piece of Saul's robe, which seems pretty, That's not a big deal to us. Immediately, David feels a pang in his heart. Right away, something doesn't sit right with David about what he has just done. No, he didn't kill Saul, but he feels guilty that he even lifted his hand towards the person who, like it or not, out to kill him or not, is still God's anointed king. He feels guilty. So he persuades his men, don't move against him. Let him leave the cave. Don't do anything. And it's worth noting here, if you've been reading the books of Samuel, David's not a pacifist, right? Dude killed Goliath. Dude's going to go on to kill a lot of other people, okay? So let's be honest about the character of David here. It's not because of his morals against killing people. He's not someone who's known for that he does this. His conscience, rather, is tied to something a lot deeper. To him, Saul was a brother, a father figure, a king, someone, again, who was anointed by Yahweh. And who is he? Who is he to end this person's life or even to cut off a piece of his clothing? David knew more than anything that it was God, not him, who had the authority to take care of his anointed king. As perfect as the conditions seemed, even though everyone was telling him it was the right thing to do, even that it was God's will for him to do, David stayed his hands and refused to do anything to the current king because he couldn't let himself cut short what God hadn't finished yet. Now, the story shows remarkable character and trust on behalf of David. And in that character and trust through the power of the Holy Spirit is what enabled him to wait when it would have been far easier to take matters into his own hands. And it's all anchored in the fact that David saw God in a way that Saul and his men could not see God. He saw God in a different way. So this morning, we're going to explore 3 ways that David sees God, that if we can see God in this same way, it will help us wait well. Here's the first one. Unlike those around him, David saw that God's timing is essential to receiving God's promise. God's timing is essential to receiving God's promise. No one would have blamed David for taking Saul's life. Again, Saul was seeking to kill him. It would have made sense. He could have claimed self-defense. And on top of all of that, God had literally promised that David would become king and Saul would be removed. Again, no one would have blamed him. And what are the odds that he would ever wander into the very cave David was staying in? Wouldn't it make sense that God had delivered Saul into David's hands at this moment for that very purpose, so that he could make good on his promise and make him king? Wouldn't that make sense? And yet, David knew he couldn't rush God. He was so attentive to the Spirit of God. When you read this, it screams the Holy Spirit. When he feels that pang of conscience, he's so attentive to the Spirit of God that he was able to hear him say, no, not like this, not in this way. Evelyn Underhill, who wrote this remarkable book, The Spiritual Life, captures a key principle that's at play here in David's story. Here's what she says. The spiritual life of man does not consist in mere individual betterment or in assiduous attention to his own soul, but in a free and unconditional response to that Spirit's pressure and call, cost may be. And get this, our own feelings and preferences are very poor guides when it comes to the robust realities and stern demands of the Spirit. Isn't that so good? David is burdened by the Spirit's conviction that his actions weren't right, and he knew he couldn't rush God's timing in order to force his way to receiving God's promises. Now, I have to step back for a moment and see how different this is from Saul. If you read chapter 13, we didn't preach through it, but if you read it, you know that Saul couldn't wait for literally anything. Saul could not wait. There's the best example of this. The Israelites are at war in chapter 13, and Samuel priest is going to come and make sacrifices so that they can win the war. And the priest is going to come, but he's delayed. And Saul's like, I need you here now, priest. And Samuel's not getting here. So Saul's like, you know what? I'm just going to do it myself. I'm not the priest. It's not my job. I don't have authority to do it, but I'm just going to do the sacrifices myself. He couldn't wait. And it's actually Saul's impatience in that very moment. It's his inability to wait on the Lord's timing in chapter 13 that we are told by the authors is why God moves to anoint another king. A king who's after his own heart and not just his immediate blessings. But David, on the other hand, the one who, despite all his faults, is ultimately after God's desires, knows that God's timing is essential to receiving God's promises. And if we're going to wait well today, we have to learn to see God in the same way. Now, that sounds good in theory, right? But it's challenging in practice. Because when you wait, it might feel like you are passing over perfect opportunities. When you wait, it might feel like it's costing you something. When you wait, you might get pushed back from well-meaning people around you. When you wait, it might bring more suffering rather than an easy escape from suffering. I know how challenging this can be. I've shared this before, but one of the most powerful moments I've experienced in the last few years is the moment when 70 teenagers surrounded my wife and I and laid their hands on us to pray for our future family. And in that moment, I vividly remember sensing God's promise that he would not forget us and he would give us children. And that promise was firm and it has stuck with me to this day. But here's the thing. That happened in 2021 and it's 2023. And these past 2 years have been the hardest to wait precisely because God promised it. Doesn't that mean it'll happen soon? Shouldn't it have happened by now? And slowly I've had to learn that God's timing is essential to God's promises. And can I just speak a word over you right now? If you are waiting on something actively this morning, just because God hasn't done something yet doesn't mean that you misheard God. Just because God hasn't acted on your timeline doesn't mean his promise is broken or null or void. I know how hard it is. It may feel how hard it is. It makes me sick sometimes how hard it is. But over the past 3 years, God has taught me to add to my prayers of why, which are good prayers, prayers of when. As easy as it would have been to escape his circumstances, David chose a life that would bring him more brokenness, suffering, and hiding. He chose what is right over what is easy because he trusted that God's timing was essential to receiving his promises. What he also saw that enabled him to wait well was this, that God's goodness is bound up in God's timing. God's goodness is bound up in God's timing. See, here's the thing. When we get frustrated with God's timing, as valid as those emotions and frustrations and longings are, what ends up happening in us is that we begin to presume that we know better than God, right? In fact, I think our humility is no more tested than when it comes to surrendering our timing for God's timing. There's a ton of humility in that. And yet, when he was being treated unjustly by Saul, twice David declares, even to Saul himself, that at the end of the day, when God's ready, God's goodness is going to take care of him, and it's going to repay Saul. But it's God's, not his. This story reminds me of one of my favorite moments and quotes from my favorite book that you probably all know by now, The Lord of the Rings. Throughout this entire story, the entire story of The Lord of the Rings, if you watch the movies, if you read the books, the longer that Gollum sticks around, the more you're like, why is this guy still around? Why don't they just get rid of him and be done with it? Like, what is the point of him still being here at this point? But there's a moment early in the books that sets the stage for the role that Gollum still has to play in the story. And it's where Gandalf reminds Frodo that it isn't his place to take matters into his own hands. Here's what Frodo says. Frodo says, it's a pity. It's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance. Gandalf says, pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Many that deserve death, many that live deserve death. Some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Don't be so eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I think David has the same vision. I think this vision is so strong that he does more than hold back from killing Saul. What does he do? Did you hear it in the story? He walks out of the cave. He doesn't just stay there hiding. He comes down and he says, hey, Saul. And everyone around him is like, David, dude, bro, like, what are you doing? You know he's trying to kill you, right? Is it just like when Sam's like Frodo, Gollum's not good. Come on, dude. But David is so compelled by the goodness of God's timing that he has the courage to make himself known to Saul. And what he finds is that even though waiting costs him something, it's absolutely worth it because of the goodness that's in store. When I was in college, my best friend Jake and I would do these things that we called delayed gratification meals. Our favorite restaurant at the time was Chipotle, a very properly rated restaurant. And we would make ourselves, whenever we knew we wanted to eat Chipotle that day, we would make ourselves not eat anything else all day until we had Chipotle for dinner. And it cost us something to wait to eat. I don't like being hungry. I'm sure you're looking at me on stage and not like shocked by that, right? But the goodness of Chipotle was bound up for us in the timing of the meal. Even though it cost something to wait, it was always worth it because the Chipotle just tasted that much better. That was our thinking anyway. I don't know if it's logic I would recommend to anyone else, but it is a similar line to the thinking of that of David. His kingship will, in some sense, you could say, taste better if he doesn't get it in the wrong way. Because he endured the cost of waiting for it to come in the right timing and the right way. Now, it's worth also pausing to note here. This is bigger than the story of David. God's goodness has always been bound up in God's timing. Scholars will note how many parallels there are in this text to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. In fact, En Gedi, which is the place David's staying, is a rearranged of the Hebrew letters for Garden of Eden. So there's a ton of connections here, but what we notice more than anything is that David kind of has a garden testing moment. It's been literally tell him in Hebrew, do what is right in your eyes, which is the thing that got Eve to take the fruit in the first place. She saw what was right in her own eyes. And David is tempted. He reaches out just like Eve. But the Spirit holds him back. He passes the test. He listens to God's voice. He won't let himself, like Eve, stretch out his hand and take what it isn't his to take. He chooses to trust God's wisdom when he is tempted to hurry the timing along. And unlike Adam and Eve, who run and hide immediately in shame, David walks out of the cave shameless. And what comes next is remarkable. Saul looks at David, and he declares, David, you are good, and I am evil. I tried to deal you evil, and all you did was return it for good. You tried to do good to me. All I did was return it for evil. But even though Saul can recognize this, he doesn't change. If you read the rest of 1 Samuel, until the death of Saul, Saul is going to continue to pridefully abuse his own power in an attempt to repay David's good in this moment for evil. This story is going to happen again. But David, on the other hand, will stay consistent in his convictions to humbly return Saul's evil with good. And it's this humility, among all kinds of other things at play here, that is the mark of the qualities God's looking for in the kind of king who's able to wait. He's looking for this kind of humility. One of my favorite quotes on this leadership quality and this example here comes from the final book of the Harry Potter series. Comparing Harry's sacrificial love to Voldemort's lust for power and control, here's what Dumbledore says to him. I think this is so wise. It's a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. Those who, like you, have leadership thrust upon them and take up the mantle because they must, and find to their own surprise they wear it. David, an insignificant farm boy who was thrust into a power that he never sought, is able to wear it well. He leaves vengeance in God's hands because he knows he cannot receive God's promises, goodness, outside of God's timing. But we still might be asking this question. Why is God taking his time? Why is he taking his time in the first place? And that leads us to the final observation I want to make this morning about God's character. Unlike others, David sees this. God slowly makes us able to receive his promises. God slowly makes us able to receive his promises. Let me say that a different way. God is okay with slowly making you into a righteous person, even if it means taking his time, getting you into the right place or the right position. Let me say it one more way. The process of formation is more important than the urgency of position. And here's the reality. The kind of person who can wait with God is the person who is more concerned with God's heart than for his throne. The person who's more concerned with what God wants and is very hard than to have a throne for himself. And God is willing to give up now the throne in order to have the person who has his heart. So he wants to cultivate, he wants to shape someone who is after his own purposes and use the waiting to ready them for what he has promised them. Now, if this is true, it means we have to correct a common misunderstanding about waiting. And it goes like this. Waiting is a passive thing. It's a passive thing. In fact, even our Christian subculture, this can be a popular idea because, we have to just go and let God, right? Let go and let God. And as catchy as that phrase is, and there is truth in it, I'm not disparaging the phrase, there's truth in it. I've always had a little bit of a problem with it. Even the most patient, prayerful waiting is an active process, not a passive process. It means willingly submitting your will to God's will. It means intentionally and humbly giving up your own plans for the plans of God. And it means actively seeking God in the midst of our deepest longing. As Oswald Chambers reminds us in My Utmost for His Highest, to wait not folded hands, but to learn to do what we are told. So as we close this morning, I just want to suggest one perspective and one posture. A perspective and a posture that God uses to form us into the people who can actively wait on the Lord and receive his promises. A perspective and a posture. Here's the perspective. God's will is not determined by perfect circumstances. God's will is not determined by perfect circumstances. Now, in some ways, we have to be honest, this kind of flies in the face of a little bit of our Christian subculture. Because I don't know about you, but growing up, I was often told, you'll know it's God's will when you feel perfect peace about this. That's how you'll know it's God's will. You will feel this perfect peace about it, and then you'll know. There's another thing that I've been told, and that I've told others. I've probably told you this, because there is truth in it. One of the best ways to know God's will is to listen to good Christians around you, right? So feel perfect peace, get the advice of others, make the decision. And often, again, this is helpful advice, has its place. But in this instance, David had everyone closest to him telling him, this is God's will. He's giving you this opportunity, take advantage of it. Everyone around him is telling him, do this. And in a similar way, I'll tell you, just honestly, some of the hardest, and also by virtue of being the hardest, the best decisions that I have ever made, I didn't feel that much peace in the moment when I was making it. Not always, but sometimes. And if you don't believe me, at least consider that Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, following the will of God, didn't quite have what we might call peace about circumstances. In fact, it's often through circumstances that aren't ideal that God shapes us. That's just a reality of life. Because here's the thing. Perfect circumstances transform a wrong thing into a right thing. That's what David's story teaches us. Perfect circumstances don't suddenly make something that's wrong okay. And we face this challenge every day in the workplace, our families, in our church communities. We face this challenge, don't we? Just because the door is open doesn't mean God is calling you to walk through it. Just because he's given you a prophetic word doesn't mean he wants you to share it right now. Just because everything feels like it's coming together doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. David had this perspective, and if we can find it too, it will help us wait well even in the most difficult circumstances. God's will is not determined by perfect circumstances. In addition to adopting this perspective, there's a posture, and it's a posture that David modeled his whole life, and it's a posture that's going to help us wait well. Here's what I'm going to call it. Lingering in open-handed prayer. Lingering in open-handed prayer. I want to submit to you this morning that there is absolutely no way that David would have been as awake to the Spirit's voice or as willing to wait if he had not spent his time on the run being formed in the crucible of prayer. He wouldn't have been able to do this if he hadn't spent his whole life ministering to Saul through singing and writing psalms in caves. In fact, this discipline of prayer, I think, is the primary way that God slowly makes us able to wait on him and receive his promises. Madame Guyon was a 17th century French theologian and mystic. And in her book, Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ, she draws this theme really beautifully. Here's what she says. Be patient in prayer. Even though you should do nothing all your life but wait in patience with a heart humbled and abandoned and resigned and content for the return of your beloved. Oh, excellent prayer. How it moves the heart of God and to return more than anything else. We have two Psalms where we are told in the little inscription at the beginning, Psalm 57 and 142, that they're prayers that David wrote in the cave. They're prayers that David prayed as he was actively hiding from Saul. His time in the presence of God was instrumental to his ability to listen to the voice of the Spirit and wait for God's timing. And this same posture of lingering in prayer was integral to God's formation of David as a king who in just a few chapters will be fit to lead Israel. And if trajectories aren't enough to compel you to reckon with the end of each of their lives. Because David, his life ended on the throne. His life ended clinging to another promise that his kingdom would last forever. Saul, on the other hand, like Gollum on Mount Doom, cut his own time short by falling on the javelin that impatiently he had aimed at David. So the question that remains for us this morning is this. Will you put your life and the lives of others into God's hands, or will you take matters into your own hands? Are you willing to be defiant in asking the most underrated question and pursue God's win so that he can teach you how to wait well? As we transition now to a time of response, we're actually going to take a few moments to wait on the Lord together in prayer. So what I want you to do is I want to just encourage you, even if maybe it feels a little uncomfortable, just go ahead and close your eyes. Close your eyes. And as you close your eyes, go ahead and just pay attention right now to your body. What are you feeling? What are you sensing? And then again, it might feel uncomfortable to you. Might not be something you commonly do, but just as your eyes are closed, just go ahead and extend your hands before you with your palms facing up. Now take those palms and clench them into fists. As you clench your fists, pay attention again to your body. What are you feeling? Ask the Spirit to show you if there is something that you are trying to reach out and grasp and white knuckle right now, just like Eve with the fruit or David with Saul's robe. Is there something you're trying to reach out and grasp? Where might you be trying to force God's timing when He's imploring you to just wait for His goodness? When you have something in mind, with your hands extended in front of you still, just go ahead and open up your hands again with your palms facing upward. Keep paying attention to your body. What are you feeling right now? How does it feel to release control and to actively submit those situations to the timing of God? How is God asking you right now to wait